So until now, we had only used Entity Manager like this. We had injected one instance and used it for different operations. So basically, there are three types of Entity Managers. This is one of them. Now let's see the other two. So two types of Entity Managers are shown over here, and the third one is over here. Right now, do not worry at all about the code. Just worry about the concepts. So the first type of entity manager is transaction scoped entity manager. So in this, while injecting the entity manager, you just specify the unit name. You don't need to mention anything else. Now there is concept called persistence context, which will be explained later on. Right now just consider persistent context behavior with regard to the type of entity manager. So just see the behavior of persistence context with respect to different entity managers. Everything about it will be explained later on. So for transaction scoped entity manager, the persistent context is going to be alive for the duration of the transaction. So usually the transaction starts at the method start and ends when the method ends, right? So the persistent context is available only when the transaction is alive. Basically, the persistent context latches on to the transaction, and when the transaction finishes, the persistent context gets destroyed. For extended entity managers, you have to specify a type attribute of extended. And one important fact is extended entity managers can only exist within a stateful session bean. It cannot exist in any other types of beans. So for extended entity managers, the persistent context lasts as long as the bean is alive. So a stateful bean, the client is supposed to remove the bean at some point of time. So from the time of creation of the bean to its end, the persistent context is alive. It is not dependent on the duration of the transaction. The transaction will start and stop over here, it will start and stop over here. But the persistent context depends on the lifetime of the bean, not the transaction. So there is transaction scoped entity manager, there is extended entity manager, and the last one is application managed entity manager. So we have seen such examples for desktop applications. Speciality about application managed entity manager is the entity manager is created explicitly from the entity manager factory. Whereas over here, we had injected the instance of the entity manager. We haven't created from the entity manager factory ourselves. It was implicitly created. So that's the difference. When we explicitly create the entity manager, it's a application managed entity manager. So the persistent context for a application managed entity manager is from the time of creation of the entity manager to the point where the entity manager is closed. So the persistent context extends from the creation of entity manager to its closing. So the first case is transaction scoped entity manager, where the persistent context lasts as long as the transaction is alive. The extended entity manager, in which the persistent context lasts as long as the bean is alive. And application managed entity manager, where we ourselves create the entity manager, and till we close it, the persistent context is alive. Now let's understand the concept of persistent context. For that, let's create an example. We'll create a new bean. So we'll name it some bean and let it be stateless, and let's not create an interface right now. Okay, then let's write a simple method in it. Public void some method. Okay, and the method, first of all, let's inject an entity manager like this. Okay, I injected an entity manager. As you can see, it's a transaction scoped entity manager, right? Now let's do things as usual. Let's create persist animal, and let's set its type to PC study, persistent context study, and a dot set total number is equal to 3. Now as usual, let's persist it. Okay, now let me add another statement to this. After persisting, that is after the persist operation, I do one more thing. I again set the total number to some other value. Now what should get saved in the database? Should 3 get saved or 10 get saved? The answer is 10 gets saved. Why is that so? How come after persisting an entity, a value can be set on the entity and that gets saved also? This is because of a concept called persistent context. So here I've shown the persistence context example diagrammatically. The values may be different, but the example is the same. So basically we first create an instance of an animal, then we assign some values. Then we call an operation on the entity manager. Whenever an entity manager operation is called and it involves an entity, that entity goes into the persistent context. Any entity which goes into the persistent context becomes a managed entity. When an entity becomes managed, any changes made to it are persisted. So over here, after the entity enters the persistent context and any change is made to it, that change gets persisted. That's why this change gets persisted to the database. So basically, persistent context is nothing but a bag or collection of managed entities. When an entity enters a persistent context, it becomes managed. So managed means that any changes made to the entities later on are persisted to the database. So when does an entity enters a persistent context? It enters only when an entity manager operation is invoked on it. Now what I have done is I injected a bin in my tester class and then I called this method, some method. Okay, and here's the output. The value is 10, not 3. Why? Because of this line, the entity enters into the persistent context and it becomes managed. When the entity becomes managed, any changes made to it are persisted. Now let's do another example and see the behavior of persistent context. So instead of this time persisting an entity, let's find the tiger entity with total number of 3 and let's modify it. So we will use EntityManager.find. And the first value is animal.class and the second value is the primary key of tiger, which is 8. Okay, and then we will modify the value. Entity manager of total number, there are 3 tigers right now, let's make it 7. Okay, now will this change get persisted to the database or not? Now the tiger entity will get the total number as 7. Why is that? Let's see this diagrammatically. So as before, the persistent context for transaction scope entity manager lasts from the start of the transaction to the end of the transaction. So when an entity manager operation is called on an entity, the entity becomes managed. When the entity becomes managed, any changes made to it are persisted. Now let's twist this example a little more so that you properly understand persistent context. So let's now create another bean, new session bean, and let's name it some other bean. Okay, let it be stateless and let it not implement any interface. Now let's add a method to it, public void some other method, and it takes instance of animal entity. Okay, and let's set the total number over here. This time we'll make it 11, save it, and then over here for using that bean we first have to inject it, right? And the name is some other bean. Okay, and some other bean. Now instead of setting the number, total number over here, let's set the total number of the tiger over that bean. So we will call that method some other bean dot some other method, and we'll pass the animal instance. Now will the tiger instance get the value from here? Will the total number be 11? It will be. Why is that? Because from here you know that For required attribute, which is the default attribute, if you do not mention anything, when the client is in a transaction, EJB uses that same transaction. So over here, our method, some method, is in a transaction because the default attribute is required. And when it calls this method, which also has a default attribute of required, it uses the same transaction. So the transaction started in this method is continuing over here. So the persistent context related to this method is also available over here. So because of this, that entity of tiger gets stored in the persistent context. Now we call this method and then we modify the total number. It's possible because the persistent context gets shared because the same transaction is going on from this method to this method. So now we can define the persistent context. So persistent context is a set of managed entities. So over here, when any entity manager operation is called on an entity, that entity goes into the persistent context. When an entity enters the persistent context, it becomes a managed entity. Any changes made to the entity when it's in a persistent context are persisted. So after entering the persistent context over here, when any change is made to it, that gets persisted. So here it is, persistent context is a set of managed entities. As long as the entity remains in a persistent context, changes made to it are persisted. Persistent context latches onto a transaction. As long as the transaction is alive, the persistent context is alive. When the transaction ends, persistent context gets destroyed, and all entities, that is all the managed entities in it, become unmanaged or detached. When an entity becomes unmanaged or detached, any changes made to it are not persisted. Now let's create another example. This time let's create a new bean. Okay, and this time let's create a stateful bean and without any interface. Okay, so let's create two methods in it. Public void some method. Okay, and let's create animal instance in it. Animal. Okay, and let's set some values. Set type to peacock and a dot set total number to 4, and then as usual we'll persist the entity. Before that we'll need an entity manager, right? So entity manager em, let's give it a persistent context. Okay, then the unit name is this. Okay, and then we persist the entity. Okay, and then let's do one more thing. Let's create a field, animal. Okay, let's create a private field. Then let's save this entity into animal field. Okay, now let's create another method, some other method. Okay, and let's make a change, total number to 3. So basically I created a stateful bin this time, and there are two methods in it. The first method creates an entity, it persists the entity, and after that it saves that entity into a field, and the other method changes the value in that field. So let's create a tester class. Okay, this time let's inject new bean. Okay, and let's call those methods. Okay, some method, then new bean dot some other method. Now tester calls this method and then this method. So will the animal or the will peacock be set with the total number of 3 or will it be set with 4? The answer is this change won't occur. Why is that? So tester first calls this method, some method. So it creates an instance of animal, assigns some value and then persists the animal. After persisting, because of the entity manager operation on the entity becomes managed and enters the persistent context. So after this, we assign the entity to a field and save it. And after this, the transaction finishes. When the transaction gets over, the entity manager gets destroyed. This thing gets destroyed. Okay. After this, there is no persistent context managing the entity. The entity becomes unmanaged after the persistent context gets destroyed. Next, this method gets called. This method assigns a value of 3 to the total number. But the thing is, this entity is no longer managed. As long as the persistent context was alive, this entity was managed. After the persistent context got finished, along with the finishing of the transaction, the entity becomes unmanaged. And now this field doesn't get updated, total number doesn't get updated or persisted to the database. The trouble with this program was the entity manager, or rather the persistent context, was latching on to the transaction. So transactions begin and end along with the method. We want a persistent context which is dependent upon the entity, which is dependent on the life cycle of the entity, and for that we used extended persistent context. So the only change you have to do to your program is, in your new bean, this time the type will be extended. Now, when you make the persistent context type as extended, the bean, or rather the persistent context, depends on the life cycle of the bean rather than starting and ending with the transactions. So when the bean gets created, the persistent context gets created, and when the remove method is called and the bean gets removed, the persistent context gets destroyed. So the persistent context lasts for the lifetime of the bean. Here I have shown the extended persistent context diagrammatically. So extended persistent context, the main thing is the type should be extended and it can be only be used in stateful beans, and as such state can only be stored in a stateful bean. So first of all, we create an animal instance, we set some values on it. When you call persist, because of an entity manager operation on an entity, the entity enters your persistent context, and because it enters your persistent context, it becomes managed. And later on, when you call this method, this entity is still managed because the persistent context is still alive. It didn't vanish off after this, after the end of the method. The persistent context latches on to the life cycle of the stateful bean. So because of this method, now the value gets updated. So let's understand an important operation called merge. So many a times your front end, that is JSP, JSF or servlets, want to display entities to the user. So over here, the web layer uses the EJB layer for getting the entities. Let's say this is the entity which the web layer has asked for, and after that the web layer displays this entity to the user. Let's say the user makes a change to the entity, he changes the total number from 2 to 4, and now the changed entity is sent back to the service layer for processing the changes. So the merge operation can be used in such use cases. So over here, I created a sample bean and I created two methods, get animal and update animal. So the JSF layer passes the ID and gets the animal over here. After that, the JSF layer can call this method update animal along with the new changed animal, and then the entity manager merges the changes. So let's see how it works. So over here, at the start of the method, a new transaction begins, and when we call EntityManager.find, this found animal enters the persistent context. At the end of the method, transaction ends and the persistent context is destroyed, and whatever animal is found over here becomes unmanaged. Next, the front end, that is your web application or the web layer, passes the updated animal to this method. Again, a transaction is created and a new persistent context is created. Now when we call EntityManager.merge, that animal enters the persistent context, and whatever changes made to this updated animal are changed or persisted to the database. However, remember that if you want to make further changes to this entity, you have to use the returned value. So over here, if you want to make further changes, let's create animal is equal to this. So on this reference, you have to make changes. not this value, not on A. So over here, let's say you want to make further change, animal dot set. Let's change the type to something else, new panda. So this change will also get persisted to the database.